Excerpt from the 709th Official Contact Report of July 29, 2018, translated with deepl.com. Disclaimer: this is an unofficial translation. Source:
Zeitzeichen
104 on page 1 to 9.
It is also true that Wendell Stevens was brought innocently into prison for allegedly having sexually misused children, which was a lie and deception, but he has not yet been rehabilitated. You Plejarens, Dud Ptaah, along with your daughter Semjase, and you, Quetzal, investigated the allegations against Wendell regarding the alleged sexual abuse of minors with great care. You investigated and clarified everything so thoroughly that it was almost exaggerated, but you could not find anything about Wendell's misconduct with regard to the accusations he was accused of. But it was not only you who fathomed the truth, for Earthlings also dealt with the accusations against Wendell and found that they could not be true, as can be seen from many letters still today on the internet, such as these two notes.
Wendell Stevens. P.S. I've been watching Wendell C. Stevens for many years. Colonel Wendell Stevens was put into jail in approximately 1984 sometime, in Tucson, for sharing too much information on UFOs. The court charge was child molestation? But many people online say he never did anything like that. Just those that didn't want him to talk about his UFO sightings wanted him to stop talking. I think he spent 5 or 6 years in jail. I keep an open mind to everything. But if Mr. Stevens was jailed incorrectly, then that would be a darn shame. I know national security is important. But why do they sometimes use child sex to ridicule or slander people?
Recently, however, Wendell and I have been stirred up by evil-minded enemies in an intriguing manner, and Wendell has also been accused, sentenced and imprisoned, especially with regard to the lying accusations of the time. Even in good or halfway good representations concerning his person and his work, things become loud, which point to criticism against him, even if in other ways, like especially concerning UFOs and especially my person etc., as can be seen from the following internet article.
Deceased UFO researcher Lieutenant Colonel Wendell C. Stevens, 1923 to 2010, copyright/source, ufophotoarchives.org.
Tucson/USA. The former Lieutenant Colonel of the U.S. Air Force, Wendell C. Stevens, is regarded by many as a pioneer and by his critics as one of the most controversial representatives of UFO research. At the age of 87, Stevens died yesterday of respiratory failure. There is no doubt that Stevens was one of the world's best-known and longest-serving UFO researchers. He was born in 1923 in Round Prairie, Minnesota, and joined the U.S. Army in 1941. In addition, Stevens later served as an air attaché for the U.S. Air Force in South America, retired from the Army in 1963 and worked for Hamilton Aircraft until 1972. During his tenure, Stevens later stated that he worked for a highly secret military project using various measuring instruments on board reconnaissance aircraft to investigate unusual phenomena, including unidentified flying objects, in the Arctic region. After Stevens later failed to obtain the results and documents of this project, he began his own investigations into unidentified flying objects, UFOs, which he continued for 54 years. He was the first director to head the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO. Stevens was particularly criticized for his supportive assessment of the events and allegations of the Swiss UFO contact Dud Billy Meier, whom even some of Stevens' comrades in arms consider to be a proven fraud, while others still consider at least some of the photographs and film footage presented by Meier as evidence to be authentic. Wendell also earned C. Stevens criticism from his own ranks for his assessment of a UFO crash event that is said to have occurred near Laredo in Texas in July 1948.
In his book on the UFO crash at Aztec, he explained that it was the crash of a U.S. experimental plane and that a body allegedly found on site was that of a large rhesus monkey. In a 2009 interview, he explained that while he was firmly convinced that many UFO crashes were due to alien spacecraft, the Laredo object was a secret project launched from the White Sands missile test site in New Mexico. Stevens also became known for his collection of UFO photos, which is one of the most comprehensive image archives on the subject worldwide. As a result of his research, Stevens published more than 22 books translated into many languages. In 1987 he received an award at the First World UFO Forum in Brasilia for his life's work in the field of ufology. Stevens himself was co-founder and director of the International UFO Congress.
Unfortunately, the Earth people are so involved in all the lies and slander in connection with the so-called UFOs, as well as with our contacts and with the false and various lying accusations against Wendell Stevens, that they consider the lies and slander as truth and are no longer able to recognize the effect of real reality and its truth. And as far as the investigation into the false accusations against him was concerned at the time, it corresponds to the fact that our extremely precise findings showed that the whole thing was based on slander coordinated by the state in order to silence him in several respects. The whole thing was on the one hand related to his knowledge of highly secret military clarifications and military findings concerning unidentified flying objects, which was feared that he could reveal it and spread the truth, but which he never had in mind to do in order to preserve his honor and confidentiality. On the other hand, he could not be allowed to continue his public activities in such a way that he would have been able to provide the irrefutable evidence for the correctness of the contacts between you and us, which was also the reason why he did everything he could to get Lee and Britt Elders and the Savadov Young Films Group to do the work on the contact film, as well as Lee and Britt Elders. However, Wendell Stevens kept his promise and remained silent until his death that he would, in which he also kept the irrefutable evidence of our existence and our contacts with you as safe as the ... which should have been handed over to the U.S. government if our attempts to contact it had come about, but for reasons of which you are aware this was not the case. So Wendell Stevens kept all the important documents that were provided with our security equipment, but through which we carried out the destruction of all the material when we realized that it was impossible for us to contact the U.S. government. For reasons unknown to us, however, some information had penetrated, which is why the U.S. intelligence services, the U.S. military, and the U.S. government followed certain clues that resulted in harassment of Wendell Stevens and ultimately led to placing him under false accusations of sexual intercourse with minors, imprisoning him.
You mention things that aren't supposed to be said.
That is so, yes, but I am speaking to you, and you know that you must not retrieve or write down what has been said.
Oh. So then I just have to skip all the things that ... so I should simply make a series of dots, I suppose.
That's the point of my words.
Sure thing. Then I would like to bring something up again. What has happened in the past, namely things and events, which some CG figure members don't know or only partly know, which is why I think that I should perform them once and which I can simply reproduce from the internet, if you allow.
There's nothing wrong with that.
I'm okay with that too.
Shall I read the whole thing to you?
Yes.
Of course you can.
Well, then here is an article that appeared in Magazine 2000 Plus, number 5, May, June 1999.
Billy Meier Albert Meier
has been malicious Lüde farmet anbrandet Swindlers be Antagonists, Liars and Slanderers worldwide since 1975. Although well over 120 witnesses have voted for the accuracy and real truth of his contacts with the Plejarens, Causity themselves have observed the beam ships and partly also him themselves in contacts. Ho various persons testifying to these facts have also been present in assignations against him and thus themselves were endangered in their lives.
Written at May 1996 by Engelbert Wachter in Switzerland.
The biggest scam in the world. In December 1998, the U.S. television station Fox insulted Edward Albert Meier with a broadcast under the title "The Greatest Swindle in the World," being Billy Edward Meier as a swindle, whereby with flimsy arguments. See our report on the 10th film. It was to be greasily proved that the contact case of the Swiss was lies and fraud and therefore forgery. Presentation of impressive UFO films. China's UFO expert Sun-Chi Lee, TV presenter Jaime Maussan from Mexico.
With this prime example of the most primitive smearing journalism, one didn't even make one's way into the trouble to listen to the opposite side, but was based solely on the claims of a fanatical UFO opponent, the American K. Korff. Korff had praised himself in his books for the Lawrence Livermore Lab, one of the largest armorers in the USA's Star Wars program. His research in the Meier case, however, consisted only of a 2-day visit to Switzerland, during which he had the descendants of a Meier opponent and religious fanatic, who saw in Meier a sorcerer and devil, and his ex-wife, but not a single one of Meier's over 40 eyewitnesses or one of the objective UFO researchers who have investigated the case. That was exactly what was done in Laughlin. Under the motto "The Reopening of the Billy Meier Case." The backgrounds of this spectacular and highly interesting contact case were examined closely. I took it.
The first was Lieutenant Col. W.C. Stevens, a retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force, who initiated the first international investigation in 1978 and spent many weeks in Switzerland to meticulously examine every claim made by Meier. Stevens told how he and his team of 4 researchers, private detectives Britt and Leodis and Tom Welch, had traveled to Switzerland with him, were repeatedly asked for information, observed and accompanied by Secret Service agents. He was followed by Michael Husserman, who had interviewed dozens of Meier eyewitnesses for Magazine 2000+ and now presented these interviews recorded on video live to the public. Husserman emphasized that the Meier case consists of 4 phases: Meier's childhood contacts with the Plejarens 5th, 1942-53, his contacts with Ascot allegedly from the Dull Universe from 1953-64, at a time when Billy traveled the Middle East and as far away as India, the Semjase contacts, 1975-84, and the Tour contacts, 1984 to today, each named after the most important extraterrestrial contact person of the Swiss in this phase.
The Meier case under the microscope on the topics. Antagonists. Author, Editor-in-Chief Hessman Michael. Declaration in accordance with an article published in Magazine 2000+, number 5, May, June 1999.
In December 1998, the U.S. television station Fox broadcast an article entitled "The Greatest Fraud in the World," in which the authentic contact case of the Swiss Billy Edward A. Meier was portrayed as a fraud with flimsy arguments. See our report on the Z film. As in this example of the most primitive smearing journalism, not even a single journalist, UFO researcher or anyone else took the least trouble to listen to the side of Billy Meier, let alone any well-known witness, such as Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Stevens, who had irrefutable evidence of contacts with the Plejarens and their effective existence. All dirty intrigues and machinations against Beam were based solely on the allegations of a fanatical UFO opponent, the American K. Korff, as well as other UFO opponents, but ultimately also on lies and slander of his wife and other malicious antagonists. Korff had boasted in his books that he had worked for the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, one of the largest armorers of the USA's Star Wars program. Korff's alleged research in Beam's case,
however, consisted only of a 2-day visit to Switzerland, during which he saw the descendants of a Meier opponent and religious fanatic, who in Meier saw a sorcerer and allegedly the devil sitting on the back of the moped of Billy Meier, when he was still traveling one-armed with his small motorbike. When Calf interviewed Beam's ex-wife in the 1980s and 1990s, he divorced her in 1997, but not one of over 120 eyewitnesses or one of the objective UFO researchers who had investigated the case. There was only hatred and revenge against Billy in the statements. But what it was made up in Lachlan, USA later were the testimonies of the younger son of Beam, who was often able to observe Plejarens spaceships himself, even on occasions when he could go with his brother, his sister and mother, as well as with various other persons to the vicinity of contact points and observe the Plejarens ships approaching and departing. Also in Magazine 2000 he reported openly about why it is extremely incomprehensible that from the year 2000 he changed his behavior together with his mother, whom he had avoided for years due to her vileness against his father Billy Meier, and since then he has publicly changed his behavior in the internet of bad paternity, etc., how the figure members insulted bad behavior against him. However, because he, Billy's younger son, publicly stood by the truth in Lachlan, USA and Magazine 2000 and witnessed his father's real contacts with the Plejarens, the background of this spectacular and highly interesting contact case was examined under the motto The Reopening of the Billy Meier Case. The beginning was made by the retired former Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Stevens, who, together with Billy, was also allowed to create irrefutable evidence for the contacts between Beam and the Plejarens and for their real existence. Evidence requested by certain secret services of Wendell Stevens on the one hand, but not handed over by him, which is why he was accused and convicted by a U.S. Secret Service intrigue against every truth of pedophilia. The evidence in his possession, however, was then destroyed by the Plejarens when, for unpleasant and dubious reasons, an intended connection with the U.S. government was not established.
Beam ship in India.
However, Wendell Stevens and his team have only examined the third phase, the Semjase contacts, so far, although, as Husserman assured us, there are other important eyewitnesses and evidence for the second and fourth phases. As witnesses to the fourth phase, Husserman presented Billy's son Methusalem Meier, 25, who disarmingly quietly and objectively refuted his mother's allegations and told of his own experiences with his father. The highlight of the second phase was Billy's stay in the Buddhist Ashoka Mission in Mehrauli near New Delhi, India, where he studied the teachings of Buddha with the now 111-year-old monk Dharmavara, who now lives with Sacramento, California and runs a monastery, deceased in between, and worked as a veterinarian. Husserman had succeeded in finding 2 witnesses from this phase and he presented them to the public for the first time in Lachlan. The main witness was Phibol Cheng, the granddaughter of Dharmavara, as he came from Cambodia. Dharmavara is a highly respected man in his country. Before he renounced all earthly things and put on the monk's robes, he was the highest judge of the country and a close confidant of the king. Phibol's father was a high-ranking diplomat and was on a diplomatic mission in India in the 60s, while she and her brother grew up in her grandfather's monastery. There they noticed a young Swiss, not only because he had 2 monkeys as constant companions, he called them Emperor and Empress Hanuman, after the mythical monkey king of the myth Ramayana, but also through his penetrating eyes.
He is friends with the goddess, the gardener told, and Phibol soon saw him too, wandering through the monastery garden with a small, narrow, long-haired woman with a round face and unusually long earlobes, dressed in a jumpsuit, often for hours. The small, narrow, long-haired woman with a round face and unusually long earlobes was the jet ship pilot Taskit from the Dull universe who appeared at Ashoka Ashram.
Dozens of witnesses saw him with the goddess of the stars, but no one dared to address her. In India the supernatural is respected. At the same time, the same and other witnesses saw the visitor's disc-shaped spaceship, as well as strangely maneuvering lights at night, phenomena that Billy photographed at the time.
The second witness, Fibol's Hindi teacher Sashi Raj, confirmed the sightings. She herself witnessed the appearance of a large black disc over the Ashoka ashram, and when she saw one of the Meier photos, she confirmed that it corresponded to her sighting. She had also heard of the sightings from numerous eyewitnesses.
In the meantime, Fibol visited Billy Meier twice in Switzerland and described the meeting with the words, "It was as if I had come home." All night long the two memories were exchanged. Since she herself worked as a diplomat at the United Nations, she belonged to the UN delegation of her country, and spoke several times before the UN General Assembly. She hesitated for a long time before she went public. Only the recent slander against Billy Meier convinced her that it was time to stand up for the truth. Now she is working with Hesseman to find more witnesses from that time.
The English was translated by Michael Hessman, Germany to German.
An interesting article that I didn't know about before.
What you have read is nothing new for me, but still good to remember.
Then the reading aloud was also worthwhile for you. But now I have something, which refers to your energy transfer, of which I know that you use an electromagnetic resonance energy transfer in your jet ships, you two in your giant room, as well as in all your various flying machines and on error in every way and for all necessities, which is practically boundless in its extension and is based on a technique, which in some form leads into the automata area. However, I cannot imagine or understand anything by the whole. Is it possible that you can explain something to me in this regard that would also bring progress for our earthly technology? It is only clear to me that in all your energy-using achievements you do not use any cable connections, etc., as is necessarily the case with all terrestrial techniques today and practically unavoidable. Floina and Injana recently explained to me that through your electromagnetic resonance energy transmission, which you call completely different and which also corresponds to other types than a simple wireless energy transmission, you can even transfer energy from the Earth into your space-time structure or into your dimension energy transmissions practically over unlimited distances.
In order to be able to explain this technique to you in detail, and make it understandable to you, you would on the one hand need many years of relevant training, because the whole thing is also futuristic for you, despite all your knowledge, which does not refer to the things of wireless energy transmission. On the other hand, the knowledge about electromagnetics is so high that its connections, possible uses and far-reaching forms would still be completely incomprehensible to terrestrial people. But they could learn very quickly. But if today, or in the near future they would be able to understand this knowledge and to use it, then a catastrophe would result, because all borders would be open to them in universal width. But this must never happen, because the prevailing attitude in the majority of mankind on Earth with regard to their ominous and completely degenerated barbarism, as well as all the malignant and pejorative attitudes and behavior resulting from it towards all life, and every creative existence in general, does not permit such knowledge. The excess and extensive destructive, dangerous, insidious, and ominous, as well as malicious, wicked and disgusting degenerations rampant in terrestrial mankind, which are founded in ideologically shaped false and heresy teachings with regard to a religious believing sectarianism, are absolutely directed only towards destruction, ruin, and destruction. This fact shows that we must not give clear and open information or explanations to your question, because the directives do not allow open explanation in this regard, because a statement would be associated with knowledge of details, that must not be officially mentioned, because they would advance earthly technical progress too much, and drive earthly mankind into a catastrophe that could not be stopped.
This is what is happening with all the machinations which have been caused by the enormous mass of the overcrowding population and which continue unchecked and cause ever worse destruction and which can no longer be stopped in the present and future time because everything has already progressed too far. I have written the following.
The humanity of the earth is crazy, and the majority of this mass acts effectively degenerated and criminal on the planet, nature, its fauna and flora, and on life itself. With what I have just said, I do not condemn the majority of the people of the earth itself, but only their deeds, their actions, their lack of understanding, their inadequacy with regard to reason and their apparent lack of intelligence, as well as their lack of peace, freedom and justice and their hostile and irresponsible thinking, acting, aspirations and actions. And even then, when I rage against US America and its irresponsible politicians, rulers, military, secret services, presidents, warmongers and their endlessly confounded proponents of war from the people etc., then I do not feel any hatred against these people, but I only denounce their anti-peace, anti-freedom, anti-righteousness and their degenerate criminal attitude and actions. I also have to mention the cowardice of those US Americans who are afraid of Russia and therefore constantly rush against it, whereby the majority of these creatures of fear can be found in US politics, among the military and rulers and their supporters from the people. All these are the ones who wage wars and torture, murder, kill and massacre countless people and have cities and entire countries destroyed and annihilated in order to beg the earthlings all over the world who then mistakenly believe themselves to be good people, even though they did not do an iota to avoid the acts of war, but if possible still supported them. So then through the good man donations in the millions and billions the people affected by the war will be helped in their need of war and everything destroyed will be rebuilt, after which one fine day the warfare, the torture, killing, murdering, massacring of people, the raping of women and the destruction of land and human achievements, as well as begging for donations from the good men for the war affected and the construction of everything destroyed, will start all over again, and this in endless succession since time immemorial. And in all this, since time immemorial the religious sectarian faith has been led into the ugly game, through which an imaginary all-giving and all-seeing God is worshipped and his supposedly all-encompassing love for man is cheered up, whereby this Almighty, however, if man allows himself to make mistakes or to offend against his laws and commandments, consciously or unconsciously, is hellishly ungracious, devilish and vengefully punishes the guilty human beings, even to the point of death. But this fact is not recognized by the believers, not understood and therefore simply accepted without thought, because they are so caught up in the religious sectarian delusion suggested to them that they cannot grasp their own thoughts, but only those hypnotically imposed upon them with regard to their belief in sectarianism. Therefore they are not able to summon up their own will to grasp an understanding and rational way of recognizing and viewing truth and to make logical decisions in order to free themselves from their belief in the delusion of God. From this fact it can be absolutely clearly defined that the belief in God's delusion suggestively imposed upon human beings clouds their understanding and reason and makes them unable to recognize the effective truth that is given in the fact that it is not an imaginary God, but they themselves all alone, who decide everything and everyone and must act and work accordingly in terms of understanding and reason. But since the God faith-hung people become stupid with regard to their faith, they become dependent faith fools, which is why it can be said that every religious belief is a mad fanatic delusion of blind faith fools. And when I put all these effective facts to the shame post and thus denounce them, be it with regard to all the mistakes I have mentioned in connection with the USA or with regard to the God believers obsessed with religious delusion. I am not trying to elevate myself above them, because I never want to stand above them or above any other people, which is why I never try to be anyone other than who I am. And exactly from this point of view I want to say something about the focal points of violence, non-violence, peace and freedom, because in the world all evil, hatred, terror and wars are constantly growing more and more, whereby in the USA Trump, his sign of absolutely incompetent president, brings the whole world into turmoil, just as in the USA, which is a world hegemony maniac as well as peace, freedom and world destroyers stand in the only and first place. Also U.S. President Harry S. Truman, who committed the greatest crime ever committed against humanity by ordering the use of atomic bombs. But also the terrorist Osama bin Laden, trained in the USA, brought the world into turmoil as a criminal, as did the U.S. Presidents George Herbert Walker Bush and his son George Walker Bush, along with various other U.S. presidents, secret services and military powers, etc. As all evil, riots, discord and lack of freedom, hatred and terror, as well as injustice, hostility, killings and murders, wars, criminality and crimes of all kinds as well as family disruptions, natural disasters, lack of interpersonal relations and the destruction of the planet, its fauna and flora and the guilty overpopulation in the world continue to grow inexorably. So also the extermination and annihilation of many living beings, as well as the more and more degenerating manifold violence, grow with it. The events of today often resemble the sequences of earlier sequences of events, developments, processes and the course of occurrences that have shaken the world in a malicious way since time immemorial and have brought damage, disaster, catastrophes, heavy blows of fate, tragedies and unstars to the people of the earth. Since time immemorial, the earth has been plunged into misery and often almost to final ruin by the guilt of mankind with evil mishap and with immense complications, disasters and misfortunes. Today, tomorrow and still in the far future, the same or similar and malignant events and occurrences threaten, which hang like a sword of Damocles over the earth and its entire mankind. In any case, it is a fact that always and in any case some earthlings, individual people of the earth, who succeeded in gaining power over peoples, were to blame for all the dramas, human defeats, fiascos, wars, afflictions, catastrophes and grievances, etc. that were brought about, but the originators of which determined their downfall before they reached the height of their power. Examples of this are emperors, kings, presidents, dictators and all sorts of other rulers who drove their and other countries' peoples into misery, death and ruin, such as Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, to name only these two from modern times in comparison, whereby such sad figures have acted maliciously, murderously and destructively around the world over all past centuries and millennia, as at that time in all old times. Today the statesmen, the politicians, the president and the rulers of the USA are despotically, autocratically, murderously and criminally equal to the old rulers from earlier centuries and millennia, whereby since the foundation of the US states, they are surrounded by the bottomless powerlessness of marginalized and humiliated peoples, most of whom tremble in fear of US power, as do the US rulers, their vassals and supporters in cowardly fear of Russia. Global terrorism, fundamentally caused by the guilt of the United States as a result of its world domination-addicted intrigues, military machinations, nasty, treacherous, criminal interferences and acts of war all over the world, reveals all around the symptom of a world that has completely gone off the rails. But this also fuels the growing hatred against America, as it appears in many countries in their populations, but in the social world as a result of disagreements between pro-USA firms and counter-USA favoring side effects such as dissatisfaction and discord occur. Consequently, in all earthly countries the pros and cons in relation to the US is a reason for disputes and quarrels. In any case, hatred is always a motive for conflict, violence and ultimately, if everything degenerates, for an uncontrollable murderous destructiveness, which usually leads to perpetrators and victims being less and less distinguishable. And this is because people have not learnt to control their emotions and other emotions, from the child to the ordinary worker to the civil servant, doctor and office holder as well as politician, head of power and state as well as preacher, clergyman and religious bronze. So the same problem also arises with the people in the political and governmental power centers, where, as everywhere, exclusion and humiliation belong to the agenda, whereby everything happens in this way in the so-called great power states somewhat differently than in the underprivileged countries. Therefore it is also the case that in the USA the presidential Trump, with his stupidity, his childish ignorance, his lack of intelligence and his abysmal irrationality, leads a confrontation of terror and war of evil, whereby he uses these two unworthy values protagonistically presidential and behaves, like Adolf Hitler once did, as U.S. leader and equally as George W. Bush used to. In this way the U.S.-American rivet President Trump behaves like a mirror image and dark doppelganger of other grand state powers, who ultimately catapulted themselves out of office through their own primitiveness, stupidity, simple-mindedness and unstoppable stupidity, or were murdered. Well, the American foreign policy devastates everything in the world and creates again and again through its gunboat diplomacy and its arsenal of nuclear weapons new discord and unfreedom in the world. The USA pursues a policy of unrestricted hegemonic supremacy, with barbaric Secret Service actions and military interventions leading to a malicious disregard for all non-American human lives. They also provide support for despotic and dictatorial regimes and unscrupulously promote their economic endeavors, just as they mercilessly eat themselves through the economies of poor countries like a swarm of locusts, sometimes treacherously and sometimes maliciously and brutally, robbing them and making them dependent on the USA in a greasy way. In this way the USA exercises a deceitfully marauding power, also here in Europe, because they influence the thoughts of the people and bring them to their side by lies and deception. If now the presidential Trump, as a leader of salvation, disregards the laws of the international community with his mad decrees etc., by which he means that he can thereby strengthen his own power and cover up his involvement in unfair machinations, and he actually succeeds, then it is not surprising that in the world victims and perpetrators can no longer be kept apart. As president he feels himself to be God and provokes desperation through his ignorant non-binding character, which he personally interprets as strength, and thus also initiates violence. And exactly this violence accumulates, whereby degenerating excesses more and more accumulate, why many people are constantly more worried in highest mass and do not know, which will happen still. Everything. Terrible events are becoming more and more frequent, with daily horrifying examples of escalations in ever worse atrocities being shown on television, the sources of which are often based on the cynical and cruel actions of national leaders. The despair caused throughout the world by the machinations of rulers, politicians, secret services and the military is aggravating the whole terror rather than fighting it. As a result, it is clear that everything is being done to exterminate humanity on Earth and to destroy the entire planet, with the best means and conditions being the ever-increasing and uncontrolled growth of overpopulation and the destructive and annihilating machinations that result from it. This may indeed be a reason why the vast majority of politicians, rulers and the entire world of the clergy, from the simple lay preachers to the clergy and the highest religious monks, vehemently refuse to point out to the citizens and the faithful of all countries possessed by the delusion of God that the destruction and annihilation of nature, its fauna and flora, the planet, all life and all existence are brought about by overpopulation and its catastrophic degenerated machinations. The majority of the state leaders and their vassals, etc., are false gods who promise their peoples strength and strength again and again, but who they cannot give them, which is why they infamously degrade all the weaker to enemies, because they themselves are the true enemies of their peoples as figures of state, and it frightens them that the peoples recognize a truth and could overthrow them from their high bases of state. But the majority of those in power of state of all kinds do not fall from the pedestals, for they continue to suggest their alleged divinity to their peoples and thus lead the whole world, as always, astray, in misery and distress, in terror, war and destruction. And these false gods suggest to their peoples a death instinct through which they seek death almost joyously, willingly, hallucinately and stimulated in rebellions and wars, when their false gods command them to do so, and they joyfully draw them into battle to murder, kill, rape and destroy, in order to sacrifice their own lives without need and unconditionally believing in the false gods. In a suggestive way, the state false gods force their peoples as real victims into deadly situations, whereby a distinction becomes virtually impossible as to how and whether the victims ultimately remain victims or become degenerate perpetrators. In principle, this leads to a development which distorts a clear and correct perception in such a way that it tends towards destructiveness and can therefore never create the conditions for peace, freedom, friendships, justice and healthy humanity. These are facts that lie on my stomach and keep me busy again and again, which is why I can never avoid not remaining silent, but talking and not keeping my thoughts to myself.
Those were good words.